this afternoon's one of the first of the concurrent sessions of the conference, and this one is on art history and material culture. And I'd like to thank you for coming today. I also wanted to mention too, to be sure to check out we have several poster displays in the lobby, and one of them is on Tlingit halibut hooks. Ken Imamura has been doing research on halibut hooks for a couple of years at least that I know of, and he's found some really interesting information about those. So those are right outside in the lobby, so when you get a chance, please check that out. And the last several clan conferences, we've had sessions on art history and culture that have involved both native artists talking about their own work and about historic artwork, and also some of the leading art historians from various universities around the country. And it's my great pleasure to welcome our first speaker today. Bill Holm is, I'm sure you all are familiar with his work on Northwest Coast Native art, but Bill has been associated with the University of Washington and the Burke Museum for many decades, and he's continues to be a professor emeritus of art history and curator emeritus of Northwest Coast Indian art at the Burke. And he's also got he and a board of directors has founded a center for the study of Northwest Coast art at the University of Washington called the Bill Holm Center. And the center provides research funds for students and scholars to study art and material culture at the Burke Museum, and they've given away a number of scholarships and stipends for researchers, and they have a really great website that if you're not familiar with, you should check it out. It's just search for the Bill Holm Center and it will come up. Later on in the conference, Robin Wright will be giving a panel discussion with some of the recipients of the stipend, the research stipends from the Bill Holm Center. So I think that'll be a great opportunity to see some of the current research that's come out of that program. But Bill, I've known Bill for many years, and I just really think very, very highly of him, especially from when I was an undergraduate student at Portland State. Me and my compatriots would frequently drive up to Seattle to visit Bill in his office, and he was always very gracious with his time, even though we were just students, but he really rolled out the red carpet for us, and I really appreciate that, since he's really so knowledgeable and has so many important projects to take time out for some young undergraduates. I just thought that was fantastic. Thank you, Bill, for that. And Bill, I'm sure you're familiar with some of his other writings. The book that he did on Northwest Coast Indian art is a classic in the field, and it's been reprinted several dozen times, I'm sure, by now, the University of Washington Press. It's really a definitive analysis of the formline design system in a formal sense. Also, there's a couple other books that you have undoubtedly seen. One called Form and Freedom that he did with Bill Reed is one of my favorites. The Box of Daylight is another one. And Sundogs and Eagle Down is a book of his paintings. He's also a gifted painter, and he's done some fantastic paintings. You may have seen one that he did of a Tlingit leader dressed in a raven's tail robe, looking at some canoes that are coming into a potlatch in Sitka. And we're happy to have that painting in our collection in the State Museum in Juneau. That's actually that's been used on posters before, and it's been published, so you may have seen it, but it's really an appropriate way to lead into what Bill will be talking about today, which is some of his research on a archaic form of dugout canoe from the Northwest Coast, the Head Canoe. So without further ado, Bill, welcome.
Thank you, Steve. I could tell some stories about Steve also, but I'm not going to right now. I am going to apologize for the fact that I'm going to read my paper, because if I don't, I will prattle and Steve will hook me off the platform. It won't get done. Okay. Which? That's the right one? Nothing happened. Maybe wrong.
No, it should be.
This should be there. Help.
We have some help on the way.
Okay. Well, I will prattle then for a little bit. In fact, I think I will even start to read my paper. It's called the Head Canoe, the historic record of an archaic vessel. 2 centuries ago, there was in common use on the northwest coast, on the northern northwest coast, a canoe that quite suddenly disappeared and was replaced by another design that survived with modifications into our present century. Not a single example of this archaic canoe remains today, and if we can, not a single example of this archaic canoe remains today, and if we can believe the graphic record made by European and Euro-American artists, none were still in use over 150 years ago. Our knowledge of the mysterious canoe form comes from those early drawings, and a good many models, some made while the canoe was still common, and others carved from the memories of traditional native carvers. This canoe form has been called in English the head canoe. Oh, we've got it. Okay. One contemporary expert, I should emphasize that, because he is, one contemporary expert native canoe maker has stated emphatically that it never existed at all, unless in a few experimental examples. The historic record, however, suggests that at one time it was a common craft from Vancouver Island to the northernmost limits of Tlingit territory. Steve insisted this was going to work. I'll try another tack. Okay. Okay. To set the stage, let's take a look at how canoes were recorded in the journals of the navigators who came to the northwest coast in the late years of the 18th century. In 1778, James Cook anchored at Nootka Sound on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and an artist on the expedition, John Webber, drew many pictures recording the form of the canoe used by the Nuu-chah-nulth people here. Here are many Nuu-chah-nulth canoes clustered around Cook's ship. They have long projecting bows with a carving at the end suggesting an animal's head and upright, flat-topped sterns. This style, sometimes called the West Coast Canoe, never ceased production and is still being made and used on the southern coast. An early model illustrates the form quite well. In later years, the bow was raised somewhat, but the basic form remained the same. It came in all sizes, from tiny one-person craft to large cargo vessels 60 feet long. On the inner waters of Juan de Fuca Strait, to Puget Sound and northward into Georgia Strait, Salish canoe makers developed another form with a projecting bow and stern with a nearly vertical cutwater. A flare ran above the cutwater clear out to the ends of the bow and stern. This canoe was apparently known northward to the end of Georgia Strait and beyond, as seen in this 1792 drawing by Joseph Baker on the Vancouver expedition. A drawing by Sigismund Backstrom in 1793 illustrates the Nuu-chah-nulth canoe above and the Salish canoes below. Backstrom shows the Nuu-chah-nulth paddlers facing the stern, a common mistake by early illustrators, as we shall see. but the details are good, including the broad raised band along the gunnels of the two Salish canoes. Edward Curtis photographed an elegant Salish canoe on the Cowichan River on Vancouver Island. It shows the gentle sheer, the cutwater, and the projecting flared bow and stern. This canoe form survived into the first quarter of the 20th century and is being made again. In 1791, Jose Cardero, the prolific young artist on the Malaspina expedition, painted this picture of Tlingit canoemen approaching a Spanish ship. This canoe is reminiscent of the spruce canoe, or sityak, in use in Tlingit country into the 20th century and again revived today. The extended bow and stern are not flared, as are the more southern canoes. This one has a raised gunnel, apparently sewn on with spruce root. Holes of unknown use are carved through the projecting ends. In the same year, at Yakutat Bay, Tomás de Soria, another Spanish illustrator, drew this sketch of a similar canoe, also with holes through the ends and perhaps with added gunnel strake. A model in the British Museum from the Vancouver expedition probably represents this type of canoe, but the ends are missing. The raised sewn-on strake suggests that it was similar to the two already described. A common canoe throughout the Tlingit country up until the beginning of the 20th century was the spruce canoe. The two ends are virtually identical, with flat upward slanting fins extending at fore and aft, a slight break or rise in the sheer inboard of each end, and a broad groove extending from this rise and along the inner surface of the gunnels. The flare of the hull does not extend along the projecting fins. This was an elegant canoe and was revived in the 20th century. I believe the spruce canoe was the ancestor of the head canoe. In this diagram, the similarities can be seen. Exaggerating the lines of the spruce canoe and broadening the bow fin results in the form we call the head canoe. The slight break in the spruce canoe's gunnels becomes an abrupt upward sweep in the head canoe. Looking like an exaggerated spruce canoe approaching this excessive design of the head canoe, this drawing by Blondella, and we don't know his first name, was made in 1786 at Lituya Bay. Blondella was an artist on the La Perouse expedition. Blondella also made the illustration of a contact by the French visitors in Lituya Bay with a group of Tlinkits in what is now clearly a head canoe. The broad bow fin, the upward break in the gunnels, and the slanted upswept stern fin are the characteristics of the head canoe. The upper picture is by Blondella as rendered by an engraver in the 18th century. I think the engraver misread Blondella's drawing and created a weird bend in the bow fin by some creative interpretation of the lighting. I've taken the liberty of recreating Blondella's drawing in the lower part by putting the end of the fin in shadow. Whatever is the case, the picture is clearly of a head canoe. Blondella's drawings are, as far as I know, the earliest renditions of this canoe design, and that was in 1780s. A few years later, in 1791, Robert Haswell came to the Queen Charlotte Islands aboard Gray's ship Columbia Rediviva. In Hancock's River, which he called it, it's Masset Inlet today, he pictured two ships of the expedition and a group of head canoes and their Haida crews. A close-up of the canoes shows clearly that they are head canoes. The upward break of the gunnels, the broad bow fins, and the projecting sterns identify the style. Joseph Ingram was much less skilled than Robert Haswell, but his drawing of a Haida canoe, a sandwich between charts of Hancock's River and Skidegats Bay, clearly represents a head canoe. The title of this painting by George Davidson, Attacked in Juan de Fuca Straits, is misleading. Juan de Fuca Straits extended in the view of Davidson and his contemporaries clear around the eastern shore of Vancouver Island and out to the Pacific at Cape Scott. The attack on Gray's ship took place near present-day Port Hardy on the northeastern shore of Vancouver Island in Kwakwaka'wakw territory. Davidson was present at the battle and saw the canoes himself. They are clearly head canoes. Here's a detail of another drawing by George Davidson of the same battle. It's typical of these early artists to pack the paddlers too tightly into their canoes. But the canoe themselves were rendered fairly accurately. Those artists were seamen themselves and aware of such details as line and hull form. Another clear bit of evidence that head canoes were known as far south as Vancouver Island is this model canoe made for Franz Boas by a carver at Quatsino Sound. Boas' text in the Kwakwaka'wakw of Vancouver Island confirms it. Quote, "The Kwakwaka'wakw, however, claim that in olden times their canoes were of a different style. Figure 116 represents what is claimed to be the typical old Kwakwaka'wakw canoe called gyatlo. It is characterized by a very heavy bow and a large high stern. The exact proportions are, of course, unknown." George Davidson in 1792 also painted this romantic imaginary scene. Notice the ladies with parasols to the left of the tree. But the head canoes are convincing. Here's a detail of the Davidson painting showing two recognizable head canoes. Also in 1792, Sigismund Backstrom drew a head canoe, again with the paddlers facing the stern. Even though these early mariners saw head canoes in use, some of them apparently just couldn't imagine that the vertical bow fin wasn't actually at the stern. Although Samuel Burling's 1799 drawing of Gunya's village in Kusta shows lots of canoes, it's not obvious until they are examined closely that they are almost all head canoes. The broad bow fins drawn in foreshortened perspective can be seen in the enlargement in the upper area of the screen, over to the right. The drawings and paintings of those early visitors are important evidence of the use of head canoes in the late 18th century, but our real understanding of the character of those canoes comes from the many models that still exist in collections today. The earliest collected models were acquired by members of the Malaspina expedition at Yakutat Bay in 1791. This small and very curved model was collected by the Czech naturalist Tadeusz Haenke and is now in the Naprostek Museum in Prague. The bold early formline design is expertly painted on the hull. And another model also collected by Haenke is in the Naprostek Museum. Also collected in 1791 on the Malaspina expedition was this small model, now in the Museo de America in Madrid. It is similar to the Haenke models, but a bit larger. It too has a striking heavy formline painting in black. These small and simple models were collected in 1792 or 3 on Vancouver's Monumental Survey of the Northwest Coast. The Little Nuchannuch model has all the attributes of a 19th or 20th century example. The head canoe model, simple as it is, has its gunnel brakes, flat and wide bow fin, and upward swept stern fin. This one has a hole through the bow, a feature that has generated speculation as to its function. Half a century later, on his western trip between 1846 and 1848, Paul Kane sketched models of both a head canoe and a munka, a broad-bowed war canoe. From those sketches, he later painted this scene, based on the inner harbor of Victoria, with Fort Victoria perched on the shore at the far right. Kane also crowded his crewmen, and he also had those in his head canoe paddled stern first. From this evidence, it seems that there were no full-size head canoes around by the 1840s. At least Kane never saw one. In the foreground, however, he painted a very nice image of a sleek Salish canoe, which were in constant use in the area at the time. The Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography in St. Petersburg, Russia, holds a fine collection of early 19th century Northwest Coast material, and their new book, all in Russian, is out, and I just now saw it. Among those objects are several wonderful canoe models. This great head canoe has a figurehead in the form of a human figure prone on the bow fin. When I first saw this canoe in the museum, all three crewmen were facing the stern. We borrowed it for the Crossroads of Continents exhibition and merely slipped the three off their thwarts, they weren't fastened on, and turned them around. After the exhibition, when the canoe and other objects were returned to Russia, the curators dutifully turned them backward again. However, I just now saw that they've been turned back again toward the bow. However, another canoe, a later northern canoe model in the book, has all the crewmen facing the stern. So you just can't win. This is another great little canoe in St. Petersburg. It's somewhat shorter in proportion than most models, which are all shorter than real canoes. As models, they look better if they're carved in the better than if they were carved in the longer, more naturalistic proportion. Most head canoe models are painted, and typically with the central portion either plain or very simply elaborated. This great early canoe was connected during the governorship of Adolf Etelin, the Finnish governor of Russia and Alaska. It's in the National Museum of Finland in Helsinki. The National Museum, an early model head canoe with elaborate form-line painting and exaggerated upward sweep of the gunnels is in the collection of the Marischal Museum in Aberdeen, Scotland. The National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. holds this very large model. Many models have form-line designs that differ from one side to the other, and this one has subtle changes that are only apparent to careful comparison. I'm not going to leave it on long enough for you to compare, but you just have to take my word for it. One of the largest and most elaborate of the known head canoe models is this one in the Florida Museum of Natural History. It's expertly made and painted with many fine details of construction. The form-line painting is elegant and elaborate. A little figure is mortised onto the bow. The painting of this model has many differences between that on one side and the other. And the center section of the Florida model is painted with a bold primary form-line pattern. I believe it is finished as it is, although without secondary or tertiary elements. This large model in the British Museum was made and painted, I believe, by the artist of the Florida model. There's a beautifully carved figure prone on the stern fin, and again, I believe that this figure has been improperly repositioned. A large model in the St. Louis Art Museum shows typical painting and variation from side to side. Although this is an old model, it shows little wear and gives us a clear idea of what these models look like when new. I've not seen these two models in the Musée de la Marine in Paris, but they illustrate the range of sizes of canoe models, as well as fine painting on the ends. The small model illustrates a foreshortened proportion of most models. Many models, I believe later ones, have exaggerated rise to the gunnels. The earlier models from the age of actual head canoe use tend to have more subtle breaks in the gunnel line. Another very large model with fine painted ends. This model in the Canadian Museum of Civilization has a very unusual and interesting form-line painting. And I'm going to move along so you won't have a chance to see how unusual and interesting it is. I believe this is a fairly early model. A figure of the torture of a suspected witch lies along the bow fin. The model is unusual in having form-line painting the whole length of the canoe. Unusually high and abrupt rises to the gunnels, and a nearly vertical forward edge allows very large and well-painted designs on the bow and stern. The only head canoe model I've seen with a sculptural figure integrated in the bow fin is this one in the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. There's also a figure carved atop the stern fin. Another unique example is this canoe in the Peabody Museum at Harvard University. The bow fin itself is rather short, but the long recurved snout or beak makes up for it. The head of the beak figure is also carved in relief, not seen in any other model. This model is similar to the large models in Florida and the British Museum in its proportion and painting. The two sides seem hardly part of the same canoe. There are so many variations in the design. I sometimes wonder if the painters found it more interesting to invent new patterns rather than to slavishly copy the mirror image of the other side. This large but very simple model in the American Museum of Natural History has a large hole carved through the bow fin. George T. Emmons, the prolific collector of Alaska material in the late 19th and early 20th century, suggested that such holes were an attempt to reduce the side windage caused by the very wide and unrelieved bow fins of the head canoe. He then proposed that a further attempt to accomplish this was to cut away much of the lower part of the fin, thus giving rise to the newer form of the northern canoe. I doubt this and will explain my reasoning in a little bit. Before that, however, I want to show a few other objects that are derived from the head canoe design. This marvelous ivory amulet combines several figures in the manner of Tlingit shamans' implements. The large figure appears to be a land otter merging with octopus tentacles. A little figure, perhaps the shaman himself, reclines on the otter's back. Below are the body and flippers of a sea lion in the form of a head canoe. The bow fin is under the otter's chin and the rear flippers extended to the canoe stern. Head canoes were the inspiration for other kinds of objects. Many grease bowls are in canoe form, but here is one in the shape of a head canoe with the forefoot of the bow fin cut back. Fine formalin carvings cover the whole bowl and the gunnels are inlaid with opercula. I couldn't resist the temptation to carve a head canoe bowl, so I took advantage of a bowl carving workshop I held in Ketchikan a few years ago. This is my little eagle head canoe model, a bowl that I resulted. The transition from the head canoe to the northern canoe is well illustrated by the painting inside an old bent corner bowl. On one wall is a head canoe with 3 crewmen with their paddles at the top, and on the opposite wall, this is on the inside of the bowl, is a new model, the northern canoe, and the bowman is aiming a trade musket. Maybe this represents the modern age. This is a very important piece because it shows both the canoe types, and it also is one of the very few northern northwest coast paintings that are sort of naturalistically representational of canoes. In 1827, Pavel Mikhailov, a Russian artist in Alaska, made these 2 drawings and a picture he was painting of the harbor at Sitka. The upper drawing shows a spruce canoe, and the lower one is the earliest drawing I know of what we have come to call the northern canoe. This vessel has the bow and stern projecting and sweeping upward from the hull, a vertical cutwater under the projecting bow, and the inner walls of the hull extend nearly to the ends of these projections, and under the gunnels there is a flare unlike anything seen in a spruce or head canoe. It's most like those southern canoes made and used by the Salish and Kwakwaka'wakw seamen. Mikhailov also made these illustrations of a new type canoe, although these were surely done from a model. The drawing illustrates the flare of the gunnels and how the flare extends down the down the hull, under the hull. The profile of the bow is narrow and parallel-sided until it drops vertically downward to form the cutwater. This model in the National Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen shows this profile very well. The custom of painting the bow and stern only persists on the newer style of canoe. The similarity of the now emerging new canoe with the Salish model can be seen in this comparison of the narrow profile of the extended bow and the sharply vertical cutwater. It's possible the new northern canoe was derived from a southern type slowly creeping up the coast in the late 18th century. Of course, this idea is conjectural. Here's another model of this style of canoe, this one in the National Museum of Finland. This large model in the Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography in St. Petersburg is a good example of that early style. For a long time, people have speculated as to what caused the demise of the head canoe. Most speculation hovered around the thought that the wide bow fin caused excessive windage and made the canoe hard to handle in a side wind. Other thoughts are that a long fin at the bow under the water makes the canoe difficult to steer or even causes it to veer, and I subscribe to both these theories. Another thought is that the lack of the flare under the gunnels at the extensions reduces the ability of the bow or stern to rise in a steep sea. I like this idea especially. The fact is that the configuration of the hull form of the head canoe and the later northern canoe are conceptually very different. This little sketch illustrates the difference. The head canoe in the lower part, bow fin, meets the swelling of the bow without the flare that is carried aft from the flared bow of the northern canoe. The first time my 24-foot northern canoe headed into a steep wave, I in the bow had strong misgivings. Don Charney, the steersman of my crew, called out, "I have faith in your canoe, Bill," and steered directly into what seemed like the towering face of the wave. The bow struck the wave and slid up the face like a ski, throwing a sheet of water outward from each side, and none entered the boat. Now the speculation might end soon. Here, there are two good head canoes under construction right now. One of them is being made at Fort Rupert BC, close to the site of George Davidson's painting of a Tactid in Wandashuka Straits. This canoe is being made by Kwakwaka'wakw carver Calvin Hunt and his crew. Here's Calvin working on the steam spreading of his head canoe. Calvin's made a number of good canoes, both in the Kwakwaka'wakw style and the New Chalnut style. Another head canoe is in the process. This one's being made by Steve Brown and his crew in Klukwan, at the opposite end of the head canoe territory. Steve's also made many canoes and understands the process thoroughly. Both these master canoe makers intend to find out, at last, just what a head canoe can do. And there is the beginning of the transition. Thank you.
Our next speaker is a well-known anthropologist and who's worked in Southeast Alaska in many years, Sergei Khan. Did his undergraduate work in Boston, but he first came to Sitka in 1979 to start his field work among the Tlingit people, was adopted by Charlotte Young of the Kagwantan and later by Mark Jacobs of the Deklawadi. He's very familiar to us in Southeast Alaska for several of his books, especially that he has written over the years Symbolic Immortality on the Tlingit potlatch tradition, and also the more recent volume called Memory Eternal on the Russian Orthodox Church in Southeast Alaska, the history, very exciting publication. And Sergei and I are going to be looking at a new publication, a relatively new publication put out by the Museum of Anthropology and Ethnology in St. Petersburg. Bill had a slide of a canoe there. This is actually what it looks like. It's very few people in the United States seem to have this, and I think it's out of print according to many of the sources if you go online to try to find it. It is in Russian. There's word of a English translation that's being prepared now. So, but I think though it's already fairly hard to come by. So if you're interested in finding out how to try to order it, send me an email, and I'll give you a place where I got my copy, and hopefully that'll still work by the time I hear from you. So, at any rate, Sergei, would you mind joining me on the podium?
But are you going to do the? I can advance it. Okay, so you'll be the slave then. Okay, this is going to be a joint presentation, and Steve was complaining about the quality of my PowerPoint, and of course, I'm not an art historian, so in the company of Steve and especially Bill with their very fancy images, this is going to be low quality, but mine's going to be more about the history of collecting by the Russians and sort of the background for this catalog and for the Russian collected artifacts, which I think are unique, particularly because of the time of the collection. And then Steve will comment on some of the objects and to give you some idea of what's in this catalog and what's in St. Petersburg. I think there will be a translation. I have been in touch with the director of the museum, who's friend of a friend or a colleague of a friend of mine. So in one way or another, I'll probably be involved in at least writing the introduction to the English version. The Russian Museum is very interested in having a translation. So I think they're quite anxious to have it out for the American reader, for the Tlingit reader. And it's just a matter of time and money, because they don't have much of it. Much money. They do have time, of course. Okay, next slide, please. This is, of course, the Kunstkamera, the original name of the museum, now referred to as Museum of Anthropology and Ethnology. This was the museum established by Peter the Great, or Peter the First, in the early 18th century, only a dozen years after he built the city on the banks of the Neva. And it was called Kunstkamera because that's what most of the museums of natural history in Europe were called. And at that time, it housed his own private collection of biological, zoological specimen, and even monsters, sort of the embryos that were born in various odd shapes. But it also had some artifacts, but no Tlingit artifacts. In 1727, it was open to the public. And in 1790s, it split into zoology and various other museums, and finally a separate museum of anthropology was established. So it's a very old museum. It's the oldest anthropology museum in Russia. Next slide, please. And so it's the original building that still stands there on the banks of the river right in downtown, and it is under the umbrella of the Academy of Sciences, so that's important. I think you skipped something. Go back. Okay. As we know, the Russians first contacted the Tlingit in the 1780s as they were coming down along the coast from the Aleutians to Kodiak. But we always think of the really important encounter in 1788, when Izmailov and Bocharov found themselves in Yakutat Bay. And I couldn't find portraits of Izmailov Bocharov, and I'm not sure they exist. But that encounter is well described in a variety of books, particularly the Freddy de Laguna's Under Mount St. Elias. I hope some folks from Yakutat are here, because we're going to show you a couple of images from the catalog. And Izmailov Bocharov received gifts from some of the Anyeti they encountered in the bay. They also visited Lituya Bay. And eventually they gave him to Shelikhov of the Russian-American Company, and he had the wisdom to transfer the objects to Empress Catherine the Great, and she gave him to the Kunstkamera. And then the next big collector was Yuri Lisianski, whom we're going to see tonight as a bumbling fool in Haenke Czech's wonderful play. So Whether he was a bumbling fool, that's up to our playwright. He was a brilliant Navy officer, a graduate of the School of Cadets, and those guys were the cream of the crop of Russian Navy. So I love the play, but I do have some bones to pick with Dave on that one. He was a scientist. He was in one of the early battles with the Turks at age 16 and came out with medals and high honor. So I imagine he was a little bit more than the bumbling fool. But nonetheless, he was also very interested in collecting and only spent a year in Russian America, in Kodiak, and of course in Sitka, involved in that whole battle situation that everybody knows about. He did some drawings of the artifacts he collected, and he's also seemed to be a pretty good-looking guy, much more good-looking than... Yeah, that's what happens when you do your PowerPoint the night before, but I bet those of you who are in college done that. Steve didn't do anything, he just kind of improvises here, so you'll forgive me. Next slide, please. There are other collectors, a number of Russian-American company general managers, particularly from the Navy cohort, who followed Baranof. Hagemeister, Tibinkov in the 40s, and several others. So what's nice about the Russian collection, even if they didn't take any notes and didn't leave us detailed description of when they did their collection, if we have the name of the person, we can date the time of the collection by when they were in New Archangel. But the really important collector was Voznesenski, who actually was the first collector with some strong affiliation with the museum. He worked for one of the museums, though not the Anthropology Museum. And it was decided by the Academy of Sciences that it was time in the early 1840s to send a person to the Russian colony to do serious collecting with documentation. So he spent 6 years mainly, I think, Kodiak and particularly on Baranof Island, collecting for the Academy, and he ends up with over 100 artifacts, just Tlingit, and then also Alutiiq and others. And he took notes. And just to mention a couple of things about him, he has a drawing of the very first drawing of a Tlingit funeral scene, which some of you have seen. I use it in my book. And it seems pretty accurate with the mourners and the opposite clan. It's a beautiful drawing. And just the fact that he was allowed to enter the big house, the clan house for that, shows that they trusted him. He has a scene of a shamanic performance, so it looks a little fanciful. But he has detailed notes on what he collected with Tlingit words for certain objects, although not terribly accurate, but we can reconstruct the meaning. So for the 1840s, particularly for Baranof Island, Sitka and Baranof Island, Voznesenski's collection is wonderful. And then the last major collection is this. The photograph is a little poor quality, but I'm very interested in this fellow, Father Georgii Chudnovskii, because he was a Russian missionary in Killisnoo. He's right there with a cross. And his papers are in the Russian church collection, and I used it quite extensively for my book on the Russian church, because he left extensive diaries and letters about Killisnoo, and he's responsible for baptizing Kitchnal of the Steenhit of Angoon, far left, Deshitan chief, Jakti, who was dog salmon. Walter Sobolev has this name now. And there are a couple of other men here, possibly Kukash of the Tekwedi, and then there are several shamans on the far right. At some point, I'd like to blow this up and look at their faces, but I just found this photograph in the catalog. There are only a dozen photographs, according to the catalog, photographs that they have in their collection. But this is a treasure because I've never seen any pictures of the priest and especially of the guys with him. And in his notes, he says that I personally baptized the these clan leaders and several shamans, who then sold him or gave him a number of shamanic objects which we have in the collection. So it may be a sign that they were ready to sort of give up the practice, because this is late 19th century. Very interesting. You could do a whole paper on, or a chapter of a book on this relationship. And he was fairly sensitive to Tlingit culture, at least he didn't attack them head on the way some of the Presbyterian missionaries did in that area at that time. Okay, enough of the background. Oh, in this picture, Chudnovskii, as you know, or Killisnoo Jake, he was very fond of being photographed. But this particular picture I have never seen. So we have another image, and what's nice, usually he's photographed alone. He has his young wife, Maria, and I think we have her Tlingit name, I just don't remember it right now. But we have, on Friday, I'm giving a paper on the Sobolov pictures, and there she's dressed in sort of Victorian clothes, very, very pretty woman. But here it's traditional Tlingit, and she was much younger than him, and they were married in the Russian church in Sitka, so they were kind of the poster children, if you wish, of the Russian church. But he was quite a guy, of course, in terms of, okay. And he was very supportive of the Russian church in Killisnoo. In fact, I think he was instrumental in getting this whole thing built, the chapel. And he was also marshal, an Indian policeman there, so the church courted him because of all these various positions. Okay, do you want to comment as we go? Okay, this is Yakutat, and first of all, I just want to say the beauty of the workmanship on this. Steve is going to talk about the object itself, but think of it, 1789, how many pieces do we have from that early a date, and how wonderful it is. Okay, take it away.
Well, I did want to point out that I know Bill, at least, has looked at this collection, and if anyone has any specific questions about anything that we're showing slides of, you might ask Bill, since he's actually seen the objects in person. In fact, usually the default position for any of my presentations is to ask Bill Holm if anyone has any questions, to the extent that I actually made Bill a little badge that says, "Ask me, I'm Bill Holm." But
Is that all you're going to say?
yeah, that's all I have to say. No, I just wanted to say this is the image on your left is one that's been published before, but until recently we haven't seen a photograph of the other side. And in fact, okay. The other side, Bill had all along he had a picture of the other side, but the first time I've seen a picture of the other side was, I think Dick and Nora in their book actually published this, but it's in the catalog too. And anyway, it's I always wondered what it was. From the other side, it looks like a painted board, but now based on this other photo and the text, it's actually a rattle. It has a rattle chamber inside it, and apparently you'd go from side to side with it, possibly. But anyway, I don't know of any others, at least to my knowledge. I've never seen another plank rattle like this.
It's about half a meter long. Okay. This is, nope. Too fast, go back. This is another object from same time, and it's a beaver inside a bear. Yeah, some of the objects which isn't going to go through because we have another paper, and the presenter is a former student of mine, so I can't shortchange that one. This is Sitka 1840, so it's most likely Voznesenski. It's a nice Shakee.at, and he actually calls it Shakee.at, so he must have picked up some Tlingit at least. Okay. Thunderbird.
Yeah, this looks like it must be a frontlet to a Shakee.at, perhaps, or maybe a front part of a headdress, but it appears to be a hawk-like creature, but it has some talons or possibly some other, I guess their feet or talons underneath the chin of the hawk, and then that area at the bottom is probably the lips and teeth of a shark. A lot of times hawks and dogfish or sharks are combined in an object. And also you might note that the hawk has humanoid ears, so it's kind of a transitional figure, part animal, part humanoid.
One other thing I want to mention, that the catalog doesn't have a lot of commentary. There's a short introduction and then very short captions. The most interesting ones are from the original collectors, and they're in quotations, and then the contemporary curator has some speculations, and some of them are based on what he picked up from other studies from other museums. And so he calls this a thunderbird, but we don't have to take it at face value, so Steve suggests it's a hawk, and so this, and I, for example, had no idea that the bottom was a shark, so it helps to work as a team. This is Tibinkov, and it is a raven. Right? One thing Steve pointed out, may I quote, Dr. That these early pieces have a lot of combination of wood and leather. This they refer to as mosquito because of the long beak or whatever you call that. Right, thank you. My English is not so good, This is, Steve, you go.
Well, sometimes the interpretation of these is really difficult because we don't, of course, in most cases know what clan something is from, and as a student of Bill Holm, I think that interpreting clan figures is really dangerous because there are so many different crests. And for instance, many people, when they see a bird with a straight beak, they automatically say it must be a raven. But there's lots of crest birds that are crests that have straight beaks, and unless you know the specific history of an object, it's hard to say what something is. But in this case, we have two. I could say that they seem to be birds or bird-like spirits because of their noses and having a beak-like form. But they also have, there's humanoid elements to the way the faces are arranged too. But this is must be another one of the headdresses. It has some painted leather appendages on the side, which seems to show up frequently in the really early headdresses.
Could the top be eagle?
Possibly, yeah.
One other thing, hold on please. In the small, when you look at the catalog, they're much larger images, but in the right-hand corner they give you the black and white pictures of what the object looked like 60 years ago. They've lost some of the attachments, but before you judge them, you have to keep in mind this museum survived the Russian Revolution, Civil War, starvation, and then the siege of Leningrad, where 1 million people died. And they were twice in their history, during the Civil War and the siege, they packed everything and they were ready to ship the artifacts, and then the staff decided to stay, partly to save the objects. And during siege, people literally dying on their way to work because they had nothing to eat. And so in some ways, the museum is, and as you walk into the museum, the first thing you see is a plaque of all the staff members who died during the war, mostly, some of bombing, but mostly of hunger. So it's a tribute to them. And the fact that Mr. Putin is now spending more money on weapons again than on museums, that's another issue. But pardon? Didn't get that one. But they're very dedicated. I mean, they may be old-fashioned in their museum techniques and all that, but they're very dedicated to their collection. Very beautiful raven dish. Steve thought so?
Yeah, I just thought this was a beautiful example of a grease dish. It still looks like it has fair amount of oil that's actually saturated the wood. And but just as far as the form of the bowl and the carving of the bird's head specifically, I think it's one of the more naturalistic carvings and just really sensitively handled.
Unfortunately, in terms of identification, this catalog or the museum catalog, they either say Baranof Island, which I think mostly is Sitka, but then they say Admiralty Islands, and I realize Admiralty Islands means anything from Canadian border all the way up to Yakutat, so this one says Admiralty Islands. Or Archipelago, sorry, it says Admiralty Archipelago. No, Alexander Archipelago. Yeah, Alexander Archipelago. Beaver dishes, the one on the right just reminded me of, the things I've seen in potlatches and the new ones people are carving, but the one on the left is kind of different, right?
Yeah, just a lot of there are quite a few beaver bowls out there, and many of them have a standard arrangement, but the one on the left is one that to me strikes me as a beaver swimming, the way that is some of the front paws are down as if they're mid-stroke, and then the hind legs are stretched out alongside the tail.
Yeah, this is the example. I'm sorry about the confusion. The one on the left gives you 20-year period, and then it says Alexander Archipelago, so that doesn't tell us very much. Whereas this one gives you the dates when Voznesenski was there, and it says, they call it Sitka Island, but that's Baranof Island. So it's most likely Sitka in the vicinity. In fact, some of the objects we're not showing you, they were clearly made in Sitka for sale to the collector, because they're more items, sort of early tourist art, but it's beautiful. This is early beaver dish, but I just couldn't keep my eyes off of it. Okay. Now there's a whole series of objects that I know Steve just loves, because that's his field, the armor and military. And this is one of the displays, and what's kind of ironic, I've seen photographs of that museum taken about 100 years ago, the old cases. And 10 years ago I was there, and you walk in the door, same old cases are still there. Partly out of poverty, but partly they have these sort of traditional views of what a museum should look like. But this is pretty impressive. And then helmet. This one was collected by Lisianski. And that's his drawing. It's a little out of proportion, but it shows you some of the attachments on the top of the helmet that are now lost. But just think of, this is what Baranof and his guys saw, coming at them. It's pretty frightening.
This one is used in Lisianski's journal of the Round the World Voyage, and during their stopover to Sitka is when the Battle of 1804 occurred, and this uses the illustration in that section of the journal, which implies that it was collected either after the Battle of 1804 or later on. There were some punitive raids going on, I think, Yangon, and maybe that was picked up after the Battle of 1804, but it was around the same time, so it has a connection to that very historical event.
So he didn't receive it as a gift. Go. But not the Tlingit. Is that in your book? Okay. It says Baranof came. We'll be done soon. Okay, mountain goat, beautiful carving. There are a couple of bear helmets, and the Russian curators claims that the material is seal, and I have no reason not to trust it. Sealskin. Yeah, okay. Keep going. This one's pretty frightening. It's a helmet, but it looks like shamanic. Bear. Of course, Raven's Tail, 1788. You know the tunic of moose hide. Bear, beaded bear, early. This, just a few words. We can go a little bit over 3 o'clock, right? So Alexis gets the equal time. This, in the Russian, the catalog is placed under at.oow, ceremonial chiefly attire, but I feel strongly this is a shamanic headdress. Shamanic headgear has sharp objects, sharp knives and daggers, and I think the conceptual idea is that shaman flew through time and space and he could cut through it. So it's a spiritual weapon or a kind of a thing you cut through clouds and so forth. So I think it's part of that shamanic worldview. Shamanic headdress with human hair. These are really unusual. It's woven and then the wolf tail attached. And then, of course, some of these masks are hair growing out of the eyeballs. And this is Chudnovskii. All the 1890 collections that we know, definitely they're from Killisnoo, so they're very well placed. Little muskets, they're tiny, like little masks. Human masks from Sitka, probably made for Voznesenski, possibly. And a hoop rattle, pretty unusual, says Steve. So this is just, there are other objects of all kinds. This is just things I thought were interesting, and Steve more or less agreed with me. So we'll stop there.
I have a copy of the publication up here, so if anyone wants to take a quick look at it afterwards, you can come up front. Thank you very much. Our final speaker in this session is Alexis Bunten. She's an assistant professor, I believe, at Humboldt State University. She did a postdoctoral work at UC Berkeley and has a BA in art history from Dartmouth and was one of Sergei's advisees and students at Dartmouth. Alexis?
Well, it's really great to be here. Thank you to Jerry and Steve and Sergei and all the other organizers for organizing this event. For me, it's really special because, as Steve just said, Sergei was one of my advisors from college up through graduate school. Still talk to him a lot and see him now as a colleague. And Steve has been helping me all along the way and has probably first met me when I was 18 or 19 or so. And Bill, we don't know each other yet, but you're an advisor by book. So it's really great to be here. Before I launch into my own talk, I want to say you guys don't know this and other people may be interested. I got commissioned a few years ago to write a museum catalog on the masks from the Kunstkamera collection. So I actually have a paper about these masks. Some of these masks we just saw, but I did it for a World Mask Exhibit catalog in China. So it's translated into Chinese, not in English. For those of you who are artists or just interested in the art, you want to learn more about some of these masks, I can pull the paper off my laptop and give it to you. I'll be here till Friday afternoon. So with that, I'll get going. Some of you here know me. I was an art history undergraduate at Dartmouth. I kind of grew up half-time in Juneau. My family's from Naknek, but I always was in the southeast area, always interested in Northwest Coast art. And kind of as an excuse to get back up here, I proposed a project on contemporary Northwest Coast artists in 1997 and came up in 98. Slight error in the abstract. I'm getting old enough to forget my years. And did interviews with something about like 50 different artists, Northwest Coast artists. I was really interested in contemporary Northwest Coast art issues. And I wrote my thesis on it, undergraduate thesis. Thank you all very much for helping me with that. These interviews are actually, I gave them to Steve, so they're somewhere in the bowels of the museum right now. And I see quite a few people who I spoke to then. And one thing over the years, having worked in a lot of different heritage industry settings, I've seen a lot of anthropologists come and go, and none of them ever come back. They tend to sometimes travel one direction. Sergei's not that type of person, and I'm not either. So now I want to revisit this project. It's almost been 11 years, and what I'd like to do is was my original vision 10 years ago, was to create a monograph, kind of like an art book in artists' own words, highlighting and promoting Northwest Coast artists of all different styles with a lot of full-color pictures and just having quotes in the artist's words and just completely skip art historical or anthropological analysis or description. Just have it completely in the artist's words. So what I'm going to do today is read some excerpts, some quotes that people had told me 10 years ago. And these are quotes from a random selection of artists. They're not necessarily the most famous artists. Some of them don't sell their art, some of them do. Men, women, at the time, some of them were at the very beginning of their career and are now pretty well known. Some of them don't do art anymore, but I'd like to revisit this project. Maybe I'm thinking summer 2010, re-interview people and go ahead with this project. So I have questions for you at the end. I'm just going to read artist quotes about a number of different issues, and I'll ask you guys questions, and it'd be great to get feedback from you, whether in this audience format or afterwards. You can come find me and talk to me. And coming from an art history background, this is a very odd presentation for me. It's kind of low tech, no pictures. Just words. So some of the issues I'm going to talk about in terms of contemporary Northwest Coast art from 10 years ago, I'm sure many of them are very salient now. I'm going to talk about transmission of knowledge in the contemporary era. Styles. What styles do people choose to work in? And labels. Do we have to use Western, art historical, or commercial marketplace labels for Northwest Coast art? I'm going to talk quite a bit about the marketplace, pragmatics of the marketplace, how it affects people's styles, when people choose not to sell their work. I'm going to talk a little bit about crests, intellectual property, tradition and innovation, protocol, and finally I'll end with a couple quotes about cultural perpetuation. So for the most part, I'm going to keep people's names anonymous, even though I did get permission to do it. It's been 10 years, so I'm going to keep it anonymous. And with that, my first quote, I will tell you the name of the person. It's from the late Louis Menard, and I'm going to give you a few quotes about learning Northwest Coast art. I guess would be in the 70s through the 90s. So transmission of knowledge, we used to have apprenticeships. Of course, now we have many other ways that the art form is passed on. One of them is through organizations like the Southeast Alaska Indian Cultural Center. So this is what Louis had to say. In 1974, I came walking out here. I got crippled with rheumatoid arthritis, and I came walking out here to visit the place somewhere around May or June, maybe. My friend here was a wood carver, and I visited with him, and then I came here and watched the old man carving here. His name was Ed James. I started with him, but then transferred to a man named Andrew Johnson, who was a teacher in the culture and language up at Sheldon Jackson College at the time. So when I learned that he was going to teach his art form, I asked if I could transfer into his class, and he said, yes, but you'll have to pay $135 a semester. And I agreed. So I stayed with him for 3 semesters, and I learned a lot from the old man. I think it's kind of funny because Louis was kind of an old man, and he keeps talking about this old man. But I learned about some of the history of our people. Working here, we have this program. That's the reason why the Southeast Alaska Cultural Center exists, is to pass on the knowledge to our young people. Where a lot of our young ladies have learned the skill of being a basket weaver, or the button or ceremonial robes, or the raven's tail robes, and the chilkat robe that they've learned here. Also, we have young men who come in here to learn how to become wood carvers and totem pole carvers, bentwood box, masks, spoons, and all kinds of woodcraft that belong to our Tlingit people using traditional form lines like our elders did. There are a lot of carvers who've come up through here who are also passing on the knowledge. So we hope to preserve it. Now, there have been a lot of young people involved in this, so we have the confidence that it will be exposed to a lot of other people in the future. Here's what somebody else had to say about learning the art form in universities. I think some people want to say that their mother taught them or their grandmother taught them, and tourists want to hear that your mother taught you or your grandmother or your aunt. And sometimes I think they're in sort of a state of shock when I say that I learned here at the university. But I think the important thing is that you're interested and you want to learn. I think it would be lovely if your mother, grandmother, or aunt taught you, but it's minor. It would be a nice thing, but you don't need it to do the art. It'd be a great story, romantic. When I've been demonstrating, people have asked me, oh, did so-and-so teach you? I say, no, I learned it at the university. I think it popped their bubble, but it's today's reality and it's okay. It's not about, oh, I should feel bad because my mother didn't teach me or my grandmother. I don't want to talk about where I've learned. I've learned from natives and non-natives, and a lot from both and everything, I guess, at the university. And that's a good thing. I think it's important that the art should be continued. Now this one's going to have a little bit of context. I don't even know if this program is still going, but in November 1997, Ross Shakely was asked to make some carvings for a potlatch. And through this, Gold Belt got involved, and they started a really great carving program at Lemon Creek. So here's a comment from somebody who began to learn their art skills through that program. He says, "If it wasn't for him," referring to Ross, "I would never be here doing the art like I am now. Ross filled out my paperwork and he brought it to me. He set me up there to do stuff for him for the potlatch, and when I went up there I didn't know anything. So the first few days I went up there, I sat and I watched Ross draw, carve, and I watched him. And then I picked up a pencil and tried to mimic what he was doing, and I was kind of all right at it at first when I first started, but he kept saying, 'This is wrong, that's wrong, do this, do this.' So I did all that, and he was like, 'That's better.' And for like 3 weeks, I stayed up until 3 or 4 in the morning and just drew all night long, different styles until I had it right. One morning he said, 'Yep, you've got it down.' And after that I did my first paddle design. Before I did the raven on the paddle, though, I was doing ravens, beavers, ravens' heads, and all that stuff before I even thought about putting it on a piece of wood. That was the best thing that ever came of that. So by that he means prison. Here's somebody switching from, now once you've learned the art form, who should do it? How do we do it? So one person said, "It helps to be born and raised in the culture. Some non-natives can adopt in the culture or are born into it, but to do the art you have to look into its background and respect the culture." So once people are producing art, they start to refine their styles, start to think about issues of if they're being contemporary or traditional, or what do those labels even mean. So here's a couple comments that people have about tradition and authenticity and style. One person says, in terms of labels, "I believe it's all contemporary because everyone's doing their own thing. That's what I try to do, is follow the old style. I don't know how to define that. It's got a look and a feel. It's tough." Somebody else, "Traditional style? Old style is what I call it. It's really fine work. Yeah, I see defining tradition and contemporary. I believe it's all contemporary because everyone's always doing their own thing. But what I try to do is follow the old style. I've been doing this for a long time and I'm still learning. I look at the old stuff and try to get that look and feel." Someone else said, "Both contemporary and traditional are the same, used either way, because traditional is defined by the way a piece is used, who buys it, etc. I stick to the form line design, or as close as I can get to it. If I satisfy myself first when designing and making a piece, then everyone else will also be happy with the outcome." Here's someone else said, "Well, that question can be answered on so many different levels. Whether something is traditional from an aesthetic point of view or a cultural point of view, that is, how it's being used by the people who own it. And it all depends. Usually in the Tlingit sense, it was all determined by the term at.oow. I read it in the Douwenhauer's book, page 22. So another person talking about these labels of tradition, contemporaneity, and now so people are talking about it in terms of the marketplace. So one person said, "The way it was explained to me by my teacher, when you do something for sale, don't do it like I showed you, because when he taught me the traditional way of doing the artwork. It's totally different from what I do now. I've been looking at all that stuff down there in the stores. It's nothing really intricate, but you can tell the difference between a traditional piece and a commercial piece just by looking at them. It's not really cultural work, but more to feed the tourists." Someone else said, "I think mine is more stylized." He means more stylized than traditional. "Like this one here looks more like a fish. In the olden days, they didn't really look like a fish. I used to do my dad's style, and then I started stylizing my own. Everyone has their own style. I can almost recognize who made what." And another person, moving more into the marketplace, asking about art, this person said, "It's mostly my job to make money. Sometimes when people order something and it's special, then I dream about it. Some people say it comes to them in their dreams. It does come to me in a dream, and I can see it. I can see what to do." There were a lot of people with really strong feelings about the marketplace, because the marketplace is often seen or felt like this pressure. It's something that allows people to make a living doing art, but puts pressures on artists to make art pieces that might move more quickly, and it makes it difficult. So it's kind of a paradoxical situation. A lot of people had a lot to say about the keystone system. And a keystone system is when you're selling your piece to a gallery. You'll sell it at the wholesale price, and then they'll double it or triple the cost of it, and that's keystoning. So this is what a couple of people had to say about that. For the most part, they're fair in reference to non-native owned galleries. Of course, they're all interested in making money, and they have a big overhead. I used to think a long time ago that they shouldn't keystone it. Yeah, I think on the big items, they just think the sky's the limit. They try and get away with as much as they can. But since I kind of figured out the overhead is steep, I think they're fair. Here's what another person had to say. These shops around here, and especially some of the old-time shops, they've taken advantage of artists for years and years, and it still goes on to this day, and it's a shame. The way these shop owners look at it, like they're doing these artists a favor. The best of them are the best liars, so they're going to have to give the artist less than half the price he wants for the piece. It goes on like that. Here's what somebody else says. When I was in Victoria, too, I walked into a museum there, and I walked into a lady and said, "Excuse me, would you like to buy a carving?" She looks at me and says, "Who are you? I don't know you." I looked at her and said, "That's okay, I don't know you either, but I'm willing to sell you a carving if you want." And she looks at me like, "Oh." And she's paying everybody else $40, $50 a pendant, and I told her I wanted $100. She paid me $100 because I sat there and I gave her back a taste of her own medicine. But the thing with all these people, if you stand up to them and tell you what you think your thing is worth, and if they want it that bad, they're not going to play that game. Then issues of cultural ownership. Should non-natives be selling the art? One person said, if everybody out there is practicing it and doing our art, it's no longer culture. Here's a prime example. I had this friend, and how they put those designs on jackets and all that stuff. This native friend of this artist came up to me and said, "Oh yeah, they," referring to some non-native businessmen, "they're doing all that stuff and they're selling it for too much, and I'm going to do better and sell it for cheaper." I looked at him and said, "Right on, man. The next person's going to come right on behind you and do the exact same thing, and so forth, and pretty soon none of you guys are going to make money. That's the way to go." He looks at me and said, "I never thought of it that way." I said, "Yeah, none of you guys ever do. You come and kill our own market. You guys think you're all being better than them, and all you're doing is killing us all." On selling the rights to designs, one artist says, "There was this one guy that was a wholesaler, and he travels around, and most of the things that he bought were originals to cast pieces out there, and I sold the rights to them right off, and he travels around. Like the pins and totem poles, those are all his, so I don't get any of the royalties back. He usually catches me in the winter when things are getting tight." Another person says, "I came pretty close to it one time, selling designs. This guy wanted me to do a bunch of castings, and he was going to pay my way to the Philippines to go and check it out. I was thinking, all right, I'll get my way paid to the Philippines, go check it out." And I was ready to go do it. And I took off, and I thought about it, and I was like, no, I can't do that. I'd have tons of people looking at me, because that's one of my strong points, If I go and do it, it's like stabbing myself in the back. That's why I don't do that. On native-owned shops, I got a really good feeling for what would move and how to work with the artists, and I realized that they really needed help. A lot of them have no background in the business, actually. They have no idea how it operates. If anything, they can work on the business as well as have the love, the passion, and the skills, because it's so much of a balancing act between the two to be successful. A lot of them have been burned so many times by gift shops and stores to where they don't trust anyone from outside the region to deal with. There's really no one here that promotes except basically natives that promote natives. There's a lot of non-natives that do it, and they're rich. They're making a lot of money, and the artists aren't. So we've got all these problems with the market, but people still try and work within it. I suspect or hope that some of these negative things have dissipated a bit in the past 10 years, but some people won't even deal with it. So here's one person's comment about just, not selling it all. So this person said, "I didn't want to do it," referring to learning to bead. "First I spoke my language, then I went to school. SJ was even worse. Then I thought, why should I want to do this? It was a relaxing thing. When they found out I could do this as an adult, they asked me to work at the Totem Heritage Center. It was something I didn't want to do, but there was money involved. My mother told me, if you learn this, it will be your bread and butter. I don't sell anything. It wasn't worth it. You have to work real hard and spend hours beating and sewing. If I do moccasin making or blanket making at the Totem Heritage, I get my money for it. I'm not going to work for less than my price. So I'm going to skip around to talk about traditional designs, crests, intellectual property. Short quote, one person says, you have to use permission even before you use your own designs. So another person on protocol and commissioning traditional designs. I know traditionally that you were always commissioned by the opposite side than what you were. The reason being was to keep the money always flowing in a circle, so one side wouldn't have all the wealth and the other side is all the worse off. Today that doesn't really happen, and I do see elders, mostly older women, who say, you can't carve that, that's my crest, who gave you permission? And that happened to me once when I carved a little something. And for some reason I lowered the price on that piece and I changed it around and it still wouldn't sell. So finally I just gave it to the lady, and after that I just asked her if I could carve the coho, and she said, go ahead, laughed, and she was happy. She was a Tlingit elder woman. It made me feel good in a way to settle that. To me, I put peace with myself. Another comment on how do you decide, like, what crest do you do? Do you only do moieties, raven and eagle? Do you do the major clans? Do you do subclans? One person says, there should be no traditional designs or subcrests on anything you make to sell. Baskets should have no traditional designs, and other objects should only be decorated with eagle or raven crest symbols. So that's in reference to objects made for the market, not the stuff you use at home. In terms of tradition and innovation, one person who's a totem pole carver said, there's a lot of people out there asking me to do stuff that pertains not to the culture. Like this guy wanted a 4-foot pole with 5 things to represent his children, an eagle, 11 things to represent his grandchildren, 1 elephant to represent his Republican Party, and a sea otter to represent his wife. Now try to think of it logistically. You couldn't realistically stick all those things on a small pole. So I had a lot of correspondence with him, and I talked him out of the elephant. And I thought I talked him out of the sea otter, which I didn't. So I ended up doing a little plaque for him with the sea otter design, and I had it mounted on the talons of an eagle, which is fine and within the cultural bounds here. Another person on tradition and innovation. Excuse me. I'm always coming up with more designs, different ideas, but the color schemes have changed. It's like a dialogue. Colors that are in, colors that are out. I don't stay with the traditional Indian colors except for when it comes to totemic designs. Then I stay within the traditional to the art form. But when it comes to geometric designs or flower designs that I'm doing, then I'll stay with what's in. But if I have the colors, like right now, chartreuse is a popular color, and I have a beautiful, 1998, and I have a beautiful chartreuse bead. And if I have the colors that are popular, then I'll put those colors together within the market that way. But then there are colors that will always do well for me, like black and gold or black and silver. Finally, a couple quotes on cultural perpetuation. One person about weaving. They wanted to dance. It was just an amazing experience when you have a robe on a loom and you only see it flat and you weave it months after months after months and you cut it off the loom and you put it on a dancer. It's just something so special that happens. Oh, you do cry. There's no way not to cry. It's a feeling you rarely get in life, and that you're absolutely incredibly lucky to have that feeling, and you didn't know it was coming. You knew it would be exciting, but you didn't know that it would move you to a place you've never been before. I mean, it's that monumental. It's like life is put into it, and you just saw it go from this flat page to this absolutely wrapping the body and the fringes, and it's just unbelievable. Another person. A part of me goes into my work and it's a reflection of who I am. Whatever I do represents my people. I don't want to feel like they would be ashamed of my work. Another person, cultural perpetuation and bartering. I bartered my native blanket, and actually we set up this deal 2 years ago when I was going to barter with my cousin. She made my first native blanket and I made her husband a hat. And it was culturally right. It was a straight trade, about a $2,000 trade for the blanket, and I made her husband a brown bear hat with the ears that actually move. So when they dedicated the new tribal house, they actually asked me to go up and dance with my new blanket. And my youngest brother has been dancing lately more than I have, so I basically got behind my younger brother and watched how he did it. And it all came back just like I was a little kid. It was really neat. And I guess it was a spiritual movement because there's something there that really touched me. And finally, one person says, well, in my case, I don't think I've had the opportunity to give it all back. Whenever I have the chance, like celebration or something like that, they'll ask for a donation for me, and I'll carve something. I'll try to find them something. If I've got inventory, I'll try to find them something that's really nice. So this is just a small collection of quotes. I'd like to ask you guys, out of these quotes, I think that all of these artists in their commentary have brought out all kinds of issues that I don't think really need to be drawn out or translated into art history speak or journalism speak or anthropology speak. I think it's just fine the way it is. So what kinds of issues out of these are still in effect today as they were a decade ago? Some of these issues probably were affecting people 100 years ago. If I can make this monograph revisit people, put pictures of artists, put their artwork up, and then put some good quotes with it, what would this monograph look like? I'm envisioning lots of photos of art and artists with quotes throughout, and little to no interpretation by the author, which I suppose would be me. And also a question for you guys, doing a book like this, should I select the best quotes from the most accomplished artists, or do like what I did here and just get a smattering of all different kinds of people? And what quotes did you like? So we're just about out of time, but if anybody wants to comment or question or say what you liked, didn't like, any ideas, shout it out.
The one where a lesson is learned, where a lesson is shared.
A lesson is shared? Yeah, and there's a lot more of them too. I just picked out random, very random quotes. A lesson is shared.
That's the way you should do it. You should keep them all random.
Keep them all random? I like it that way too.
There's plenty of people that don't sell.
Yeah.
Just have their own art, their own art.
Do you think some of that stuff about the marketplace is too controversial to put out in this kind of a, or that, you know, maybe I could make it anonymous, or would I say, I mean, obviously, I would, those of you who are artists, I'd ask you.
Yeah. When my mother was asked to sell her bead for wholesale, I told her to tell them it's never made by machines. They're made one at a time, and they're made by hand. It's not, she relied from
Wow. I actually talked to your mom. You should get it. It's at the museum.
Can you tell us what she said?
Can I tell you what she said? I don't. Oh, she said when her mother was asked to sell her artwork, that to say that the beads were not manufactured, they were all made by hand. The beadwork was made by hand. I'm sorry. They were not made by machines and not wholesale.
I think it's really good to have quotes from a cross-section of people, because the trend is still interviews with the famous artists. So we have, you know, half a dozen books about Robert Davidson. He's a great artist, but there are other artists out there. Hear their voices.
Yeah. Did you all hear that? No? Yes? He said, okay.
There are too many books about
yes.
individual famous artists on the Northwest Coast. A lot of people get left out.
Yeah. Well, it's about 3:04, so I'm just going to step down and hang out a little bit, probably move to another session, but come give me feedback. Oh, there's a break. Thank you.